we're learning Jeremiah is in chapter 27 this morning. And somebody said Jeremiah would be a good teacher in a children's class because there's so many object lessons and different things. And there are some of us adults who enjoy object lessons and seeing things. But you think about Jeremiah, he once was told to take his belt that was made out of cloth and to carry it far off and dig a hole and bury it. And then he went back home, and then he's to go back and dig it up out of that hole, and it's rotten, and he's to go back and put it on and then stand up and preach. And you wonder, what would people think as he's doing that. Another time, he bought a clay pot, a brand new clay pot from the potter. And he went outside the walls of Jerusalem, and everybody's gathered around, and he held up the pot, and he took that pot and he said, well, see this? This is God. This is God's people. This is what's going to happen in Jerusalem. And then he just smashed it down on the ground. Another time he was told to go into the marketplace, and there were two baskets of figs. One was rotten and one was good. And he was to point out those figs and say, well, we're like the rotten figs. So in this chapter and what we're looking at today, so it's Jeremiah 27, he uses a farm instrument, a farm implement. Look at verses 1 and 2 of chapter 27. In the beginning of the reign of Zedekiah, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, this word came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, This is what the Lord has said to me. Make for yourself restraints and yokes and put them on your neck. A yoke, as probably most of us would know, is a piece of wood that would join two oxen together to a plow. And so you picture Jeremiah wearing this wooden thing on this big yoke as he's walking around. And once the oxen were under the yoke, then they're ready to work. So once Jeremiah's under that yoke, he's ready to work. And he uses this yoke to teach three lessons. And these are the points that we're going to look at in this chapter. That God is ruler over kingdoms, God is ruler over kings, and God is ruler over his people. And to sum that up into one statement, it's God is always in control. And I think this is very practical for our lives. It doesn't matter what president is in office in our nation. It doesn't matter what governor is governor over the states we live in, or who the officials are. God is in control. He's always in control. And it's pretty easy for us to get upset because we have, you can just get instant news. They'll pop up on your phone and, worldwide, and all kind of situations and peace and lack of peace and war and all these economy. If you think about all those things and you get all that news every day, and there are some people who just focus on that news all the time, it's pretty easy to become upset and to become fearful about that. Now we live in this world. We're to be good citizens. Paul says in Philippians 3, our citizenship is in heaven, but we're still citizens here. And so those things affect us. It affects the economy, it affects the work, it affects when we go to the grocery stores, it affects when we pay taxes. All those things affect us, and we're to use the means that God's given us, vote, and we are to pray for our leaders. But as God's people, we have to remember God is always in control. That's what this chapter is telling us, that God rules over kingdoms, he rules over kings, and he rules over his people. So let's go through these points one by one. They're pretty simple, but in verses 1 through 11, once Jeremiah finished making the yoke and putting it on and walking around with that, verse 3 says, and send word or message or them. That's what the Hebrew says. The restraints, the yokes, send them to the king of Edom, the king of Moab, the king of the sons of Ammon, the king of Tyre, to the king of Sidon, by the messengers who come to Jerusalem, to Zedekiah, king of Judah. One Jewish commentator says that what he's sending is not a message, but little duplicates of this yoke that he's wearing. I don't know. I just know the Hebrew says send them. But if it is little duplicates or little models of the yoke, it's still the message. So get the message to them. Send this message to them. And at this point, Jerusalem is filled with all of these foreign diplomats from these nations. Special envoys from all these places, Edom, Moab, Ammon, Ammon, Tyre, and Sidon. They're all gathered in Jerusalem, and they're gathered in Jerusalem for a summit meeting. And they're gathered there because they're trying to plan something. And what they're trying to plan is a military coalition to throw off the Babylonian power. By this point, Nebuchadnezzar has already come into Jerusalem. He's taken away some of the things from the temple. He's carried off some of the people. And so this, chapter 27, Nebuchadnezzar has already come. And it's a couple of years after that. And now these other kings, all these envoys have come to Jerusalem. And they're planning to revolt against Nebuchadnezzar. Back in 597, Nebuchadnezzar downsized Jerusalem and carried people off into captivity. And the Babylonians set up Zedekiah as like a puppet king. He's under their control. And this chapter is probably written around 594, so it's 3 or 4 years after Nebuchadnezzar's come in. But especially at this time, Nebuchadnezzar seemed weak. There is a work called the Babylonian Chronicles. It's not just one tablet. It's about 45 tablets. And it gives major events in Babylonian history. It's in the British Museum. I've never been to the British Museum to see it, but they're there, and that collection is there. It's written in this type of script, cuneiform script, but it gives a narrative or the history of the Babylonian Empire. And there's some important things in there. I mean, there in that particular tablet that's on the screen, it talks about when Nebuchadnezzar comes in and captures many in Jerusalem in 597 that we talked about. He gives that record in his history. But also in the Babylonian Chronicles, there is a statement that about 594, when this chapter happens, that Nebuchadnezzar had a lot of things going on in his kingdom. He was putting down an attack by an enemy. He was putting down a revolt among his own people, and he was launching a military campaign against the Syrians. And so all of that's like world history. And they know that. And so with Zedekiah in Jerusalem, and then all these other envoys come to Jerusalem, they're planning, Nebuchadnezzar is more than 1,000 miles away. This might be a good time for us to revolt. And I'm sure all the political analysts would say, yeah, this is the time. If you're going to do it, this is the time. I mean, had you interviewed some of these envoys, these political envoys who are in Jerusalem at this time, they would have said, yeah, Nebuchadnezzar's got his own troubles. He's far away. This is the perfect time for a revolution. But there's only one problem. And the one problem is those politicians didn't seek God's will. Because God doesn't want that revolution. He doesn't want that revolt. And so Jeremiah, walking around wearing this yoke, goes to these political messengers and he has a message. Look at verse 4. Order them, God says, order them to go to their masters, saying, this is what the Lord of armies, the God of Israel, says. This is what you shall say to your masters. I have made the earth, mankind, and the animals which are on the face of the earth by my great power and by my outstretched arm. And I will give it to the one who is pleasing in my sight. And now I have handed all these lands over to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant, and I have also given him the animals of the field to serve him. All the nations shall serve him, and his son and his grandson, until the time of his own land comes. Then many nations and great kings will make him their servant. And then skip down to verse 11. But the nation that will bring its neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon and serve him, I will let remain on its land, declares the Lord, and they will cultivate it and live in it. Jeremiah's diplomacy wasn't very diplomatic, because all these government leaders have met and they said, this is perfect time to rebel against King Nebuchadnezzar. And Jeremiah, God says, you send this message to them and say, go back and tell your masters, this is not the time. You are to submit to Nebuchadnezzar. I have raised him up. Jeremiah's policy calls for surrender. One commentator pointed out that Jeremiah is using half of a yoke, and that implies that there's enough room for somebody else to come in that yoke with him. So all of you need to submit to the Babylonians. Now, what if they don't do that? Well, it's deadly. Look at verse 8. It will be that the nation or the kingdom which will not serve him, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and will not put its neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon, I will punish that nation with the sword, with famine, and with plague, declares the Lord, until I have eliminated it by my hand. Sword, famine, and plague is like shorthand for all the bad things that God can bring, the punishment God can bring. And it shows all the earlier prophecies are fulfilled. Back in chapter 9, it says, the days are coming when I'll punish all who live in the desert in these distant places. And those days are close now. Back in chapter 25, we saw where God pictures this cup of judgment that's to be poured out. And it's to be poured out on Edom, Moab, Ammon, all the kings of Tyre and Sidon. So all those nations, God says, you need to bring yourself under the Babylonian yoke, Babylonian control. You either surrender or you are destroyed. You perish. Now, what do you think those government ambassadors, those envoys, thought of Jeremiah walking around wearing this yoke and saying, you need to surrender to the Babylonians? And the word that he gives from God, who said, I'm commanding you to do this. I made the earth. I'm the one who raised up Nebuchadnezzar. Do you think maybe they thought, well, who does the God of Israel think he is? How can the God of this little nation of Judah say he rules over us? I mean, what business does he have ordering us around? We're mighty nations. That's probably what they thought. And Jeremiah's point then is that the one true God rules all kingdoms. Look at verse 5 again. It's a great verse. I have made the earth, mankind, the animals which are on the face of the earth by my great power, by my outstretched arm, and I'll give it to the one who's pleasing in my sight. In other words, the one that I choose. God made everything, so it all belongs to him. And so he rules the earth by virtue of creation. He's always in control. And we have to remember that when we look at the world around us. Now, verse 5 ends with a remarkable statement. God says, I'll give it to the one who's pleasing in my sight. The one that means anyone I please, anyone that I choose. God's rule is absolute. He is powerful. And he can just speak about, I'll give it to the one that I want to give it to. Another commentator stated that he's like this industrial leader who used to do television commercials for an electric razor. And he said, I like this razor so much that I bought the company. So I'm using this razor. I started using this razor, and so I just bought the company. God can say similar thing about kingdoms. All right, Nebuchadnezzar, I control all kingdoms. Nebuchadnezzar, you want a kingdom? I give you a kingdom. I'm in control of that. And so God's ruling over all kingdoms probably challenges our limited perspective of world events. He's in control, and he's still in control. He's always in control. And he calls his people to pray to him. I mean, who's to say that a praying church actually can't change world affairs? We can, because God is always in control. And we submit to that. One person said, who was a missionary, he said, God has a worldwide purpose in Christ that encompasses all history, all creation, and all people everywhere, especially those yet to be reached by the gospel. That's God's purpose in Christ. And the question is, do we believe that? So God rules over all kingdoms. That's what verses 1 through 11 is teaching us. Now, look at 2 verses in that section, verses 6 and 7. If he rules over all kingdoms, then he rules over all kings or all leaders. And it seems to be a sub-point, because he rules over all kingdoms. Well, that's the same thing as saying he rules over all kings, but it's something that needs to be emphasized, because he is King of kings. There's no human king. There's no human ruler who is equal to God. Now look at verse 6 again. So he said in verse 5, I'll give a kingdom to whoever I please, whoever I want to. Now look at verse 6. And now I have handed all these lands over to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant. And I have also given him the animals of the field to serve him. That's how he describes Nebuchadnezzar. And that's kind of remarkable how to describe Nebuchadnezzar for a couple of reasons. I'll hand it over to my servant Nebuchadnezzar. First, it's pretty condescending to speak about the most powerful man who was alive at that time. He's the most powerful ruler in the world at this time, human ruler at this time. And God says, he's my servant. That's like a powerful king speaking of a vassal king, another king. He's my servant. He has a little power, but he's my servant. God just speaks so casually about this world superpower and the leader of the world superpower. He's my servant. Another thing that makes this remarkable is that God says, he's my servant. Nebuchadnezzar was a cruel and a wicked king, and there are references in the history that describe all that. He ruled Babylon with force. He crushed people. I mean, the Babylonians were mighty. They were mighty in military, and there's some cruel things that are described. And yet God says, this fierce king, this cruel king, is my servant. Even God's powerful enemies are his servants. He's not saying he's my servant and that he's obedient to me. He's chosen to obey me. He's saying he's my servant because I'm using him. And I can use his choices. We talked about before in Ezekiel, as Nebuchadnezzar is marching to Jerusalem, he's marching to that area, and he wants to decide which city to conquer first. And he comes to Jerusalem, and I think the other city is Rivlah. And so he comes to that area, and it's a crossroads. It'd be like one sign, Jerusalem this way, Rivlah this way. And Nebuchadnezzar says, where do I go first? And he takes some arrows and shakes them up, throws them down on the ground, and it's supposed to be some kind of a thing to point him which way it goes. But God said, I'm controlling those arrows, and God said, you go to Jerusalem. God controlled where Nebuchadnezzar would go. And yet Nebuchadnezzar has free choice. But God says, he's my servant. Now, even Nebuchadnezzar realized he was God's servant. There's a statue of Nebuchadnezzar the second. That's who this is, who is God's servant. Very powerful. But one night, he took a stroll on the roof of his palace, his royal palace in Daniel chapter 4. And as he's walking around, he surveys his kingdom, and he would have seen the famous Hanging Gardens, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And he said, "Is not this the great Babylon I have built as my royal residence by my mighty power and the glory of my majesty?" And all those personal pronouns in the I are emphatic. I built Babylon. And the answer to that question is no. You didn't build this. And it says, while the words were still in his mouth, that God brought him low. In Daniel chapter 4, verse 31, the words were still on his lips when a voice came from heaven. "This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken away from you. You will be driven away from people and will live with wild animals, and you'll eat grass like cattle." And so he needed to learn a lesson. He needed to learn this lesson, Jeremiah 27:5. God says, "I made the earth, mankind, and animals. I'll give this to whom I please." He needed to learn that the Most High is sovereign and absolute control. And he ended up learning that lesson, but he learned it the hard way. In Daniel chapter 4, verse 33, when that message comes from heaven and says, "Well, I'm in control, Nebuchadnezzar, you're not," immediately what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people and he ate grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. I mean, just picture that. This great king, Nebuchadnezzar, and God brings him low. And one person suggested it's ironic that he becomes like a beast, because in Jeremiah, God says, "I'll give the wild beasts to him. I'll give you control over them." But Nebuchadnezzar becomes like a beast, eating grass out in the field. And another person said it's not only ironic that it becomes like a beast, it's also appropriate. It fits him. This person says it's not a case of just God going down a list of various punishments available and saying, no, let's see, what am I going? Let's take this one, insanity or becoming like an animal. God doesn't work that way. Everything God does is significant. So this commentator says when God caused Nebuchadnezzar to be lowered from pride to be associated with beast and behave like a beast, God is saying by that punishment, that's the result when humans give the glory of God to themselves. They become animal-like. They become beast-like. So Nebuchadnezzar is a warning against pride. He's against our pride. We have nice homes, big buildings, large bank accounts perhaps, good education. And Nebuchadnezzar says, you're not in control. God's in control. Trust in Him. He's a warning to us when we think, well, I've been pretty much a success in life. I mean, perhaps things are going well, your career's going well, you're making decent money. Nebuchadnezzar says, God's in control. You're not in control. Don't take credit for that. Don't be filled with pride. And so in Daniel 4, verse 37, here's what he learned. Here's what he discovered. And he himself wrote this. This king in history, Nebuchadnezzar II, wrote these words. Those who walk in pride, God is able to humble. And in Daniel 4:32, it tells us, at the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified Him who lives forever. I don't think that's saying he becomes a believer in God, but it says he recognizes God's sovereignty. And here's what he says about God. His dominion is eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the people of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as He pleases with the powers of heaven and the people of the earth. No one can hold back His hand or say to Him, what have you done? Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, glorify the King of heaven, because everything He does is right and all His ways are just. Those are the words of this king who learned that lesson. God rules over kingdoms. He rules over kings. He rules over presidents. He rules over governors. He rules over any ruler. And then, thirdly, in this chapter, verses 12 through 22, God rules over his own people. Jeremiah had exactly the same message to his own people. So what was the message? The message is, don't rebel against Babylon or Nebuchadnezzar, submit. Because they're planning this big revolt. Jeremiah's walking around with yoke on, and he says, you need to submit to the yoke of Babylon. And so look at verse 12. I spoke words like these, all these, to Zedekiah, king of Judah, saying, bring your necks under the yoke of the king of Babylon and serve him and his people and live. Why should you die, you and your people, by the sword, famine, and plague, as the Lord has spoken to the nation that will not serve the king of Babylon? God gave Zedekiah the same choice. Submit to Babylon. Submit to the yoke of Babylon. And yet they would not. And the reason is God had said earlier, you can submit to my yoke of obedience. And they said, we will not. Back in chapter 2 of Jeremiah, verse 20, long ago you broke off your yoke and you said, I will not serve you. Breaking away from God in obedience never brings freedom. It brings oppression. The gentle yoke of the obedience of God is replaced by oppression. And that's what's happening here. Jeremiah's message was not popular. The captivity had already begun. And yet there's still false prophets running around. Look at verses 9 and 10. As for you, don't listen to your prophets, your diviners, your dreamers, your soothsayers, your sorcerers, who talk to you, saying, you will not serve the king of Babylon. For they are prophesying a lie to you in order to remove you far from the land, and I will drive you away, and you will perish. God said they're prophesying in my name. They're lying. I'm not saying that. And what are they saying? You're not going to serve Babylon. It already began. It began in 597. And they're lying and reject their message, he says. And so Jeremiah speaks to the people, and especially the priest, and there's a big issue that they're having. They said, well, what about the things that Nebuchadnezzar's taken from the temple? Is that going to be restored? I mean, Nebuchadnezzar came in, he ransacked the temple, and he carried off most of the things associated with the temple. Well, those are national treasures, but they're also a part of the worship of God for the people. Will those be restored? Look at verse 16. I spoke to the priest and all the people, saying, don't listen to the words of the prophets who prophesy. Behold, the vessels of the Lord's house will now shortly be brought back from Babylon, for they're prophesying a lie to you. Don't listen to them. Serve the king of Babylon and live. Why should this city become a place of ruin? In fact, things are going to get worse, he says. Look at verse 18. If they're prophets, and if the word of the Lord is with them, have them now plead with the Lord of armies that the vessels which are left in the house of the Lord, in the house of the king of Judah, and in Jerusalem, do not go to Babylon. If they really want, if these false prophets, or these prophets, as they're calling themselves, want to be useful, they should spend time praying to God that the rest of the things in the temple are not taken away. And the things that he left behind, Nebuchadnezzar didn't take everything from the temple. He left pillars that were in front of the temple. He left, it's called a sea, but it was a big basin for washing. And he left these stands that were used for washing as well. There's kind of a picture an artist thought up. Those two big pillars, Solomon built those bronze pillars. Nebuchadnezzar took them apart and carried them to Babylon. That big thing there, it looks like a big bowl. It's called the sea. He took that to Babylon as well. Now, the false prophets are saying he's going to bring them back pretty soon. We'll get these back. and we'll get all the others. Well, no, these things were left. I'm sorry. These things are left. He couldn't get these the first time, but he's going to come and take them. And so all this came true. He came and he took all the rest of the furnishings. He took all this off, and the people had to bow to the yoke of Babylon. But God is still a God of grace. And these, look at the last two verses, verse 21, 22. This is what the Lord of armies, the God of Israel, says concerning the vessels which are left in the house of the Lord, in the house of the king of Judah in Jerusalem. They will be brought to Babylon. So he will come and he will take these things here. And they will be there until the day and the I is God speaking, I visit them, declares the Lord. Then I will bring them back and restore them to this place. And they remained, and the Bible tells us in Ezra, we don't have time to go over there, but Ezra chapter 1, verses 7 through 11, they stayed in Babylon the whole time through the captivity, but they were returned to Jerusalem in 539 BC. And so there's this grace of God. It's a reminder the suffering of God's people won't last forever. Even the exile didn't last forever. God brought them back, and even brought back the furnishings of the temple. As long as it's God's yoke, it's a good yoke. And it's the yoke of Christ, as you remember this passage here in Matthew 11, when Jesus said, "Come unto me, all you that labor or burden down or heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon me. My yoke is easy and my burden is light." The invitation song is 772, Why Do You Wait? If you're not a Christian this morning, this is an invitation to submit to God's yoke. It's a loving yoke. It's an easy yoke. But it's submitting to what he says. Now, God gives us free choice. If we say, no, I will not submit to God. I will not submit to God's yoke. That's the same thing that happened back here in Jeremiah's time. People said, no, we're not submitting to God's yoke. And God said, okay, well, you will submit to a yoke. And they submitted to the yoke of Babylon. God was working in that. And so, is it a yoke of obedience or a yoke of oppression? God is calling us to obey him in his Son and what he did, sending him to be our Savior. If you're not a Christian, we call you to obey, submit to the yoke of Christ, turning away from sin, turning to him in living faith and being baptized. If you've done that, and it's possible to fall away from that yoke, to obey and then to say, no, I'm not, I'm living for self and sin, to turn away. But the good news, the grace again of God is that there's still time and God is pleading, come back and submit to my yoke. We're here to help you in any way while we stand, while we sing.